Hi, this is John Ottman. I was the composer and the editor on the film, not necessarily that order. Um, I'll try to keep this interesting without sounding like a robot. Now that we're in the opening title sequence, I'll just jump right ahead and say what first comes to mind, and that is I'm a huge believer in title sequences for films, and I really feel like they sort of set the audience in the mood that they're in the proper mood of what they're going to see, and it settles them down. And for some reason, it just, to me, thematically is the right thing to do. You can establish musically the pastiche of the movie and establish a theme that you're going to refer to later in the film and tell your musical story. And of course, we had no budget to do a main title sequence, so what I did is I found some extra footage of panning water that had been done when they were shooting the boat sequence in San Pedro. And Tom had obviously, the DP had obviously seen the ripples in the water and the lights and wanted to shoot it, but it wasn't quite enough. So they were still shooting that sequence, so I had him shoot some more of that panning, but it still wasn't quite long enough. So I ended up looping it 2 or 3 times and creating this sequence, but you can tell sometimes the water repeats. But it's sort of a really low-budget way of creating this elegance of this opening that we really wanted to tell the audience this is not going to be what you expect. And I think the water and the title sequence had a lot to do with that in combination with the music. And this sort of piece of music I had actually started writing before seeing the water. It just fit like a glove over the rippling water because of the sort of element in the strings. And the funny thing about that is I had written that so early on. But when we did screenings of the film for executives, we wanted the score to sound better than my horrible synthesized renderings. So we ended up putting in Basic Instinct because it sounded most like the theme I'd written. Many people think that my theme was an answer to Temping with Basic Instinct, but it was really, for the record, the opposite. But I was really glad to have the sequence because it did establish the feeling that we wanted in the film, and confused some executives, I'll have to say, when we showed this film to them for the first time. They sat me and Brian down. I remember one day outside at a table, at a park bench table, and said, "Look, we were expecting the score to be a lot more hip than what you've temped it with." And Brian and I looked at each other, and I'll never forget this, and we at the same time said, "Good," because that's what it's not going to be. Because a lot of the fear was that we thought people would see this movie as an answer to Pulp Fiction, like we quickly slapped this thing together to ride on that bandwagon. But what no one really knew is that we were filming Usual Suspects at the same time or before Pulp Fiction was filming. It's just that our film stayed in the can for a year before it was released. So this was not an answer at all to Pulp Fiction. It was just its own unique movie, and I thought that by making this score completely different from what you would think and making the film a lot more romantic and elegant, that it would separate it immediately. This scene is really interesting because most people don't really ask, why does he ask what time it is? And the reason is because the whole explosion of the boat used to be a whole different storyline, which I ended up cutting out of the film. It used to be that Keaton laid a bomb in the boat to destroy it, and he knew that the boat was going to explode very soon. So therefore he asks, what time is it? Because he knows that even though he's crippled here hopelessly, that Keyser Söze is about to die anyway. But we changed the storyline, and we ended up doing some pickup shots in Brian's backyard. And when we get there, I'll show you Brian might have brought this up, but the foot of Keyser Söze is Brian, and the hand dropping the match is my hand. And we did this so that the ship exploded just as a happenstance of the fire, as opposed to another subplot. And Brian, never knowing exactly what I'm going to be doing in the editing room, always covers himself and will do weird things. And people on the set may ask, well, there's my hand right there, and Brian's foot in his backyard. He'll shoot things, and sometimes they'll use them and sometimes they won't. But he did a shot of Gabriel Byrne in the Fedora hat shooting. And it really worked out well in the montage in the end of the film to make the point that perhaps he is Keyser Söze. One of the great things about being the editor and the composer, and with the director who understands the use of music in movies, is that the score is mixed correctly, meaning that even after in that last explosion, you can actually hear the score over the explosion, which is unique in films today. Brian's point of view and mine is if the music is working uh, in the movie, then anything else should take second seat to it. And if it's a sound effect sequence, then there shouldn't be music. Sometimes there are exceptions, of course, but music is usually offering an emotional uh, sinew for the movie, and to keep interrupting that with sound effects makes the film less strong. These scenes were, I mean, always things are always a little longer than they end up being. At least with me, I tend to cut a lot, and the bottom line here was to keep the film moving and get the idea across that these suspects are being lined up or arrested in an economic way, and we had actually interrupted this whole sequence by then going into a restaurant scene with Edie and Keaton, and we decided it just disturbed the whole pace of the arrest, so we cut it out and came into it midstream. And that's one of the deleted scenes, which we can talk about later. I really felt uninhibited doing this movie because when we set out to do the film, we really had no idea, what was going to happen to it. I just saw it as a glorified student movie that we were doing, just like we'd always done. And I didn't really know who any of these actors were because I don't really see that many films, and so I was able to treat them like characters without being intimidated by the persona of who the actors were. And in that regard, I felt really uninhibited in the editing room and would try things because I saw this as, this was an independent movie and we could do things that normally a studio may scoff at. So I would just, do things for the sake of doing them, knowing I could always undo them. And jump cuts were something that I decided to do a lot to give it pace, but also to make it interesting. But there's a fine line about going overboard with jump cuts and being overly stylistic over the content. So the arrest sequence, yeah, that was fun to do in jump cuts, and also jump cuts tend to cover up inconsistencies in continuity. Also, you can get away with a lot of stuff. Oh, the Spacey's VO is really funny because for months, of course, it was my voice over the movie, and we just got so used to that. And by the time we replaced my voice with Kevin's, it was strange for a while to get used to, even though he, of course, is far better than I was. I'm an awful actor. But we were just used to it. And a lot of the voiceover did change. I would sometimes come up with my own voiceover to accommodate story points, and it would usually be the lame version of what Chris McCord then would rewrite for me that I would read. There's a scene that's coming up much later I'll talk about outside the police station after they've been rounded up, was all constructed voiceover to basically accommodate getting rid of a scene that followed and explaining why they were going to do the taxi heist. I'm not often on the set, but I get the material, and I can only imagine what happens on the set based upon the off-camera dialogue and yelling and screaming. And this was apparently a late night. Everyone had gone through a lot already, and everyone was getting sort of giddy. And I found that the bloopers, so to speak, of the actors just sort of having fun and much to the dismay of the crew, were far funnier than the actual scripted moments. And so I just used a lot of moments where the actors lost it, like right here. You can see, look at Keaton, he's just starting to crack up, and that's not supposed to be that way. But so they were sort of winging it, and it matched together pretty well cutting wise. I didn't know if by using the bloopers I'd be able to seamlessly put it together, but you don't really notice the inconsistencies in the continuity, and it just made the scene a lot more fun and made you warm up to these characters. And they had to say these lines, and I think they must have felt as actors kind of silly just standing up there in the lineup after for so long, saying what they had to say. This was where I really started experimenting with and discovering how you can put lines of dialogue from one character into another character's mouth, or even using different takes of a character's dialogue in the actual from another take on a different visual of the same actor. And it's a way to control performances sometimes. Sometimes visually a performance is really good, but the dialogue may not sound as good, and so I'll sometimes take dialogue from another take and slip it in slip it into the mouth of a different visual take, and it's amazing how consistent the actors are in their timing. You can really fool around a lot. Um, so here, these jump cuts were a lot of fun to do, and because we had a gargantuan amount of material here, I remember sitting in dailies with one of the producers, Robert Jones, and he's looking at me and he goes, "Oh my God, what are we gonna do?" I said, "Don't worry, it's gonna be a lot shorter because these guys just went on and on and on and on. A lot of this was ad-libbed. Right there, you could see Benicio started saying, 'I want my lawyer,' but I used Hockney's voice, and that was the kind of fun stuff I tried and was so elated when something like that would work. These wipes across this interrogation they never quite wiped the frame, which I found very frustrating. If you watch the scene, I basically it was covered in two shots of each actor, medium wide and close, and I wanted to sort of be able to cut in and out of the close-ups by using the wipes of the interrogator walking by, who's Chris McCory, and unfortunately the frame is so wide that the wipes never quite fill the frame, but it ended up working fine. Everyone, you get the gist of what I was trying to do. This, when I got the dailies, I had no idea sometimes what Fenster was saying. It's funny now watching the movie years later, and I completely understand everything he's saying. But then I had to sort of listen a few times and to make sense of what was going on. And which was the sort of challenge of this entire movie is to make sense of what's going on and try to try to know the story so well and ins and outs and to editorially make sure things made sense after you saw the film and looked and went back again. And so it was really brain hemorrhage sometimes to constantly keep track of what was going on in the story to make sure that I was making sense of things. This is one of those scenes which is dangerous because I wanted to take the time, but I didn't want to lose the audience either. And but again, this was not a studio picture where everything's had to be flying by every 5 seconds, and so I wanted to sort of get into the characters, especially Keaton, and I sort of kept him at a distance the entire scene and waited until this push-in that Brian is so fond of doing, as opposed to cutting to a close-up of him and match the other actors. I wanted to keep his space away from the other actors because he is, he's different from the rest of them right now, and he's trying to be clean, and of course that's why it's been blocked the way it is too, where he's across the room. So when you see the way things are blocked, you want to make sure that you're keeping the director's intent alive editorially as well, and not ruin it by just slamming into a close-up right away. I mean, this scene obviously, there's no need for music, and I wanted to sort of break from everything that had been happening, and the music sort of never stops up to this point. Well, up to the interrogation really, because it's bringing you into the film and the energy, and then it stops here just for a moment for us to get to know everyone.
Forget him. Did you get to talk to your lawyer?
This whole thing was a shakedown.
What makes you say that?
How many times you been in the lineup? It's always you and 4 dummies. PD are paying homeless guys $10 a head half the time. And there's no way they'd line 5 felons in the same role. No way. And what's a voice lineup? Public defender could get you out of that one.
So why the hell was I strip search?
It was the feds. A truckload of guns get snagged. Customs comes down on top of NYPD.
Yeah, this is a scene that actually lost, not a lot of people, but I remember that the film at this point might be interpreted as, oh boy, this is going to be a slow movie because of this scene. But if you stick with it and listen to what they're saying and sort of relish in the characters, it doesn't seem as long. But if people hung in there and got through this scene, which I actually enjoy, and I think in retrospect, if you know the movie now, it's an enjoyable scene. But when you're seeing the film for the first time, it may seem like, oh boy, this is going to be one of those really independent movies where it's all in one room, which basically this movie is. It's from an interrogation room, but we make all of these departures, which is what made this film successful in terms of being told from one room. But we kept it exciting by going into all these fantasies or real situations that Verbal was talking about.
All right, now look. We've all been put up by this whole thing, right? So I figure we owe it to ourselves to salvage a little dignity. Now, Me and Finster heard about a little job.
Why don't you?
You know, and of course, this is told from Verbal's point of view. So I had this theme come in for Verbal on the soprano saxophone, which really, if you listen to the theme closely, is the main theme of the film. La da da da da da, and his theme goes ma da da da da, and I did that throughout the movie, which is sort of a subliminal cohesiveness I try to create in the score, but it's sort of a street savvy kind of theme for him. But there's also something more to it because it is based upon the theme of the movie.
You're missing the point.
No. You're missing the point. I don't want to hear anything from you. I don't care about your job.
You know, to keep the story coming from his point of view, I had this sort of theme that then we revisited. But because he's Kaiser Soze in a sense and controlling all the action, I felt that the actual theme of the movie should be his theme.
Gone the high road. What is the world coming to? Fuck 'em.
And that was how it started. The five of us being brought in on a trumped-up charge to be leaned on by half-wits.
And even in the taxi heist cue, which we'll come to later, it's that da da da da da da da da da. It's actually da da da da da da. It's the same theme.
Was that these men would never break, never lie down, never bend over for anybody. Anybody.
That was shot in Brian's backyard, by the way, as well. That's not. But we just needed a close-up of a body.
Who are you? Agent Jack Bayer, FBI. How many dead? 15 so far. They're still pulling some bodies out of the water, though. Any survivors?
I should talk a little more about music from time to time, since I'm sort of caught up in the editing here. There's a few themes in the film. Besides the overt theme for Kaiser Soze, there's sort of the mystery theme, which I touch upon very briefly here, and then it just goes into something that's functional when we rise above the building. But this is sort of the introduction of the mystery theme, I call it. And this was revisited in the hospital room when the Hungarian is talking, and also whenever Kaiser Soze is talked about. Why I wanted to do that, I don't know. I just thought being too literal with the actual theme of the film would be too relentless. And so there's sort of the talking about Kaiser Soze theme, and then the actual Kaiser Soze theme himself. This is a pretty funny situation. We had a lot of second unit footage of planes flying overhead for a scene later in the movie with the New York taxi heist when the drug dealer comes to town. But I used it here early in the movie because there was no explanation how Kuyan was in New York one moment and suddenly he's in San Pedro. It was very confusing. So I wrote some dialogue of him, being over the phone answering machine, basically telling the audience he's flying to LA now. And that was not rewritten by Chris. That was actually my brilliant dialogue. But then we put him through a telephone answering machine filter as if he was leaving a message for someone. And it's sort of a really corny idea, but it ends up working. No one really laughed at it, so we got away with it. These are the kind of scenes editors like, where there's no cut. It's just one Steadicam shot, so there's no editing involved. But it is agonizing too sometimes, because you've got to make sure you take the average of what the best performance is throughout that particular take, because you can't cut between takes if it's just one shot. It's really easy to see scenes like this and not think much of them, but I remember what a nightmare even little scenes like this were in the editing room, because of course we were on a splicer and a flatbed, a Steenbeck, which is editing on film with film all over the room, my cat getting its claws caught in the sprocket holes, and me slamming down the splicer on my finger, getting blood throughout the movie, and I really wanted it to have a good pace to it and also keep with the characters, and a simple little scene like this I'm actually really proud of, because I'm cutting to the reaction shots, and there's a great power in editing between two characters talking more than you would think, more than an action sequence or something like that. It's just the decision of when you cut to someone and pulling off and making the performance even better than they necessarily were before, and anyways, it's just difficult. It was difficult with splicing tape and splicers on film. So when you felt like the pasting was really good, it was even more rewarding back then. Because on the electronic editing, of course, you can just keep tweaking effortlessly till the end of time very, very quickly. So editing on film, or starting editing on film, really gave an editor the discipline to make a decision and think about what he's doing before he even starts. I would actually approach a scene and think about in my mind how I would ideally like to envision the scene first before I even go into the landmine of what the footage is. And of course, the footage will dictate sometimes what you have to do because of inconsistencies in continuity and so forth. But at least you have a roadmap or a story you've written first as an editor, and it gives you a big, much more clarity, I think, to go about that way. And you had to back then because you couldn't change things very easily. Brian and I used to go to movies and be able to actually pinpoint most films that were cut on the electronic system versus film, because most of the best editors did not know the electronic systems yet. And so you had a lot of techies and computer people cutting film on the electronic medium, where the best edited films were still being done on film. Of course, now it's different. Everything is done. All the best editors now are on the electronic systems, but they have that discipline, I think, of having started on film. This scene was a nightmare because the guy speaking another language. I had no idea what he was saying, so I had the interpreter send me faxes of lists of the dialogue and translation, and I got most of it right. And knowing that 99.9% of our audience isn't speaking Hungarian, I sometimes took some freedom in the flow of the scene as opposed to exactly what he was saying. And I think some Hungarian audiences might have been cracking up when they watched the scene. This the DP on this movie, Tom Siegel, has talked about, he's a great DP, and but certain things do happen, and this was a horrible thing for Tom to have happened. The first stuff that was shot in this movie was this scene, a lot of footage from the scene, or I should say, footage in this room throughout the movie. And these shots of Verbal and a couple other shots, there had been a mistake in the camera. I think one of the crew members they put the wrong gate in the film. Now you can't tell from the final product, but when we were watching dailies, here we are in the first day of dailies, and we see on the left-hand side of the screen where Verbal's entire, almost his hairline is right there, was cut off completely. You couldn't even see his ear. There was this black bar. And here we are in our first day of dailies. Brian can get very excited very quickly, and he's yelling to the projection room that something's wrong. Get that goddamn mat off the projector. There's something wrong. And as we were horrified to learn, it wasn't the projector. It was shot that way. So many scenes many shots in that room had to be optically blown up and to get that bar out of the way. And it was one of the continual nightmares getting opticals to be clean. They were very dirty all the time. We had to redo them and redo them. And you can't tell on DVD, but in the theater you could tell that the shots that had that problem on the left with the mat incorrect were a little more blurry than the rest of the shots in these scenes. But you would never know now. But it was a big dramatic moment as we first started watching dailies.
Are you trying to get a rise out of me, Agent Cooper?
And Tom, of course, felt horrible, but he since then has completely redeemed himself. I don't think he did it anyways. I think someone had put the wrong mat in. And again, these are the kind of scenes that are the most fun to cut because it's just between two people, and again, just a frame or two can make the difference of how a character comes across. And I'm one to hardly ever go back to the same exact take. In other words, this take of Kujan takes us from one take of Spacey to another take of Spacey. Then we go back to Kujan, and we come back to Spacey again, and maybe be the seventh take, because each take has something special in it. Could be down to just an eye blink that I make a note of, and so I think there's an average of maybe 10 or 15 takes, and I probably use every single one of them. And on film, that was really hard to do. I had, literally, I was a very sloppy film editor. I had film just strewn about across the entire house. and my assistant constantly picking up my film piles. But but it was quick to do it that way, just throw the film on the floor and get to the next, find the next piece. One of the fun things to do in a movie like this is to create sequences where if you go back and you realize what really is going on, early when Verbal is just sitting there bored in the room, just waiting for Kuyan to come in. When you first start the movie, you just think he's just, sitting there bored and waiting for what's going to happen. But in reality, he's thinking. And part of the brilliance of Spacey's performance is when you go back and look at the scene, you can realize he is thinking. And what I did is then used some footage we had of the bulletin board for later in the film for the finale, and cut to it as if he was looking at the board, not just thinking, but planning. And so we didn't have a whole lot of, I really milked blood from a rock, or whatever the phrase is, on that bulletin board, because we didn't have a whole lot of footage. We just had these scattered panning shots back and forth and some close-ups. And I didn't have much to spare, but there was one kind of slowly moving pan across the bulletin board. And that was a fun little moment to put in. No one, of course, would ever guess by showing that at this time in the film that he was reading the bulletin board and thinking of things to say, perhaps in his interrogation, but it's just a fun little touch. The cigarette box was also something that never really came to fruition, but I also cut to that on the desk and just lingered on it because it was just something, just to give you the impression of something's up, but you're not sure what. One of the decisions an editor has to make is whether to favor continuity or performance, and sometimes it's an amalgam of both. When Keaton comes out of the lineup outside this police station and he's talking to Edie, naturally it's he's concentrated more on his performance than what he's doing with his cigarette, and his cigarette is completely all over the place. But so my decision was to favor his performance over exactly what his cigarette is doing, but you can't completely favor the performance, because if the cigarette is way out of whack, then even the general audience is going to notice there's a mistake, which then suddenly the film seems sloppy or something. So it was a real bitch to edit this scene when he's talking to Edie here, because I wanted to keep the flow up and I wanted to keep him going in his best moments of his best takes. And as I say, footage is often a landmine, because just when you want to cut just to the right moment of a performance, the cigarette's in the wrong place. But that's the whole thing about editing. And so that was a fun moment. I mean, people have noticed, that the diehards, that his cigarette is often out of place. But you'll watch. Thelma Schumacher tends to do the same thing, even more overtly. She just says, "Screw continuity, I'm going for flow." Because I remember there was a scene in Goodfellas where, I don't remember what the scene was, but one guy had a phone in his hand one moment, the next moment the phone's gone, and you cut to the guy and he's talking to him, he's got a cigar in his mouth, and then the next shot's gone. And so, but it's cut so quickly you don't even realize it. But the performances are what's primary. This scene offered a huge solution that we desperately needed. The taxi heist that they end up doing was a plan that Verbal came up with and confided in Keaton to tell him. And there's a scene that was shot at Edie's apartment where Keaton's living, where Verbal confides in him and tells him, "Look, I have this plan, we've got to do this thing." And unfortunately, with the shooting schedule we had, or Brian had, he was only able to cover that scene in a master, and it wasn't the best scene in the film. In fact, it was easily the worst scene in the entire movie, and we just could not keep that scene in the movie, because one great thing about Brian is if something's inadequate, he's okay with cutting the whole thing out. But this was early on in the process, and I remember sitting there with a production manager. She looks at me and she goes, "Well, how are you going to make this movie make sense if you get rid of that scene?" So I went home and I racked my brain. How in the world am I going to have them have planned this sequence, this taxi heist, and also get across that Keaton is living with Edie without having that scene in the film? So this scene, I wrote some of my cheesy dialogue explaining that Verbal had a plan, and he didn't know if he was going to go for it or not, and they had to tell Keaton they needed Keaton's help to pull it off. And then, thank God, in the tail end of the scene we cut out, Keaton slams Verbal up against the wall, and that's where I cut in to the very end of the scene that I was talking about, that was cut out. And thank God, Verbal mentions, "Is this your place?" And you realize that he's living with Edie. So we were able to get rid of that entire sequence. And here we go right and slam into the tail end of the scene that was cut out. This originally was, there's this large master shot in Edie's apartment. She offers verbal a glass of water, and it's this really awkward thing because there was no coverage, and I really couldn't do anything with it, and it was just not a good scene. And then after she leaves to go get them a glass of water, Keaton drags Verbal over to this hallway, and that's why I chose to cut into it and cut the rest of the sequence out. But sometimes it's really good there's a redundancy in dialogue because he really repeats a lot of things in this little snippet that infers information he had told Keaton in the scene that was cut. And the other great thing about a movie like this is you not only take chances in cutting things in a frenetic way, but you also take chances in not cutting. And that's the fine line of not getting too excited or masturbatory about your cutting, because then you start to you're selfishly pushing your craft over the good of the film. And here's a scene where, there was no need for coverage whatsoever. Brian did his classic, subliminal push-in to keep the scene somewhat interesting, and also it's the design work is done so well. It keeps your eye interested. And musically, this was a fun moment in the movie for me, and also another way of taking chances where there's no huge moment that comes in score-wise, just this lone wood block, and it's when he starts talking about the heist and what they're going to do. What I did is I had cut the scene to a certain beat. I never do that. I never think about the music really when I'm cutting. Maybe subliminally I do, but in this particular scene I had to, because the footage of the aircraft approaching the airport was so inconsistent and bad. What I did is I knew that I'd had to pull this off in jump cuts, and they'd have to match the score ultimately when I did the score. So by doing it to a certain click, I knew that whatever I was to write would end up matching perfectly. And of course, as you notice, we had a great shot of a 747 approaching and only a good shot of a L-1011 landing. But this is something some people have noticed, and but hey, that's now I understand why these things happen in films, because the shot of the 747 landing sucked. When we scored this, it was one of the funnest moments when we were scoring the movie. It just sounded really great with the cellos. I tend to always overscore when I do a film, which is something Jerry Goldsmith said he always does, which is good, because then you have more music than you need. Knowing full well some things might be cut, but at least I'm covered. And most often it's kept. This whole sequence, I think, was originally not supposed to be score, but I kept the score going just to keep it moving. But then when the actual heist occurs, it was far more gritty and realistic to have no music at all when it actually goes into this sequence. It would have been really cheesy to have score in this over this whole sequence. And those are decisions you have to make.
You guys want? Don't fucking put your fucking thing on that fucking cop, stupid asshole! Watch your fucking move, motherfucker!
You want a buckshot shampoo, chubby? Shut up!
This was from, I remember Brian complaining this was a very difficult day for him because, again, I think the entire shooting schedule for this movie was 28 to 30 days, and this was a helter-skelter day with a camera going all over the place. But it worked out great, cutting things really quickly and dubbing dialogue over sequences that, over actors that necessarily weren't saying what they were saying.
There's no fucking money! Give me the money! Give me the fucking money! Do it! Give him the money! Give me the fucking money! Give him the money! Hurry up! You know the fuck I am! You people know the fuck I am! Fuck!
We do now, jerk off.
Paul Bartel here is just hilarious. I mean, what a brilliant casting thing for a drug dealer. It was just fun to do this scene. And I tend to love using wipes, and Brian knows that, so he is sure to make sure a lot of things wipe during frame. And again, it is sometimes the obvious thing to do, so it's a fine line of being obvious about using wipes in a frivolous way and all, or just having it add seamlessness to the scene. And that there was a lot of great wipes in that little moment there, in the post taxi heist moment.
He's 250.
You wouldn't know it from this scene, but I, for some reason, always remember cutting this scene. It was a really super, super hot day. It was probably I lived in the valley. It was 110 degrees. I had a room air conditioner sticking out of a window and plastic draped down half the room to keep it cool. And I had been editing for hours, and then I had to deal with this scene where there was just a lot of inconsistencies, which you wouldn't know now. I just remembered it was just very difficult for me to keep moving, and it's been so long now I can't remember exactly what my problems were, but I do remember it was one of those scenes where I just had to get up and walk around the house for a minute and come back and just keep trying. Again, I can't remember exactly what the continuity problems were. I think it was this trio situation here, but again, I don't remember. But these close-ups of Keaton allowed me to draw on them as I did for many scenes in the movie. Later in the film, in the montage where Kujan is interrogating Verbal, and so I used a lot of footage from this scene in that later montage of Keaton sitting there looking evil, which he didn't in this scene, but in context he would. This scene of, there's a lot. I mean, this is just the normal thing in films. This scene actually was much longer. It started out a secretary at a desk, and then it dollied by, and people were walking through. It ended up on Keaton sitting there with Verbal in the office, and it was just like, So those are the things I just hacked right out immediately. And of course, I know Brian was like, but it was this great, panning shot and it introduced the office. And I go, who cares? We have exterior of the building. We know they're sitting in an office. Let's just get to it. And of course, it doesn't take much because Brian is really good at understanding the logic of the situation very, very quickly. And so it wasn't a battle at all.
We're gonna miss the plane. She'll understand.
This is a little nice moment between the two of them. There's just enough between the two of them in this film without seeming nauseating. This was a repositioned shot. I remember there was a big black bar on the left. This is why Kujan's eye is cut off, because we had to blow up the shot so much to go to the black bar on the left.
You want to wait outside?
You guys wanted to know what happened after the lineup, I'm telling you.
Come on, Verbal.
But had it been a studio film with, not final cut by the director, I'm sure that the love affair between Keaton and Edie would have been played way up and really taken the meat away from what essentially is a guy's movie. But it's I think it's just a tad, just enough of their affair.
I was a cop for 4 years. Who else would know the taxi service better? The job had his name written all over it.
But Edie had him all turned around.
Let me tell you something. I know Dean Keaton. I've been investigating him for the past 3 years. The guy I know was a cold-blooded bastard. IAD indicted him on 3 counts of murder.
Chaz Palminteri had a lot of tongue-twisting dialogue in this movie, and where he had to talk fast and just keep rattling things off. And I, of course, exploited that at his expense in the blooper reel, but he did a great job. It's just it was not in this particular scene, but other scenes. It was quite an editorial experience to splice together the greatest moments of his diatribes he was going on.
Can't prove the best part either. Dean Keaton was dead. Did you know that? He died in a fire 2 years ago during an investigation.
Space is great here. It's just, in all these scenes, just thinking and calculating the whole time. There's one scene later on where he sort of even gives a little bit of a smirk before Kujan sits into frame, and we rack back to Kujan, and he erases his smile immediately. And it's amazing, I mean, it's not amazing. Now, the audience has no idea what's going on, but it's, in retrospect, it's such a giveaway that he's hiding something. But it's just great little moments like that.
Agent Bear.
Let's get the show on the road.
Agent Bear.
Yeah, wait, just
this
wait, hold
is
on.
not what we discussed. There are far too many people in
Look,
this
doctor,
room. Please put your
doctor,
hand
look, I promise we'll be out of here before he blows his porch light, okay?
I have a noon meeting, Bear.
Yeah, okay,
Agent
okay.
Bear,
Look,
5 minutes.
Look, everyone just calm down, all right? I want you to ask this man about the shootout in the harbor.
İşit van şey getirin iteye gel. Ő akarja tudni, mi történt a kikötőbe.
Ott voltunk egy pasast megvenni. Haza akartuk vinni Magyarországra.
He says they were buying dope.
We know.
Ez a pasas ismerte az ördöget. Ő dolgozott vele.
He doesn't know what they were buying, but not dope. People.
What?
Megölnek engemet. Nem érted? Én láttam az ördöget. Láttam. Szemtől szembe láttam.
He needs
Engem meg
guarantees.
tudott nyugodni.
What is he talking about? Guarantees?
Én
He says his
láttam az
life's in
ördöget.
danger.
Szemből szembe láttam őt.
He saw the devil. Looked him in the eye.
I'm on my way.
No. Wait a minute. Ask him to tell him what he told me. About the devil. Who's the devil?
Okay, ki ez az ördög? Kit látta?
Kaiser Söze.
Again, here's when he begins talking. This is of course the talk about Kaiser Soze music, which is basically heightens your interest level and intrigue, and there's this otherworldly character, and it's not evil music. At least I think it's in this scene. It's not evil music, which would be the common thing to do. It's very magical and mysterious music, but more magical really, which sort of in a strange way adds more, pulls you in more, and makes it more mythical as opposed to just straight sinister music, which would be sort of the surface level thing to do as opposed to digging underneath. And I think the fact that the music does that, if I do say so myself, is sort of it really heightens the interest factor, especially when the long scene when Pete Postlethwaite comes in and talks to them in the pool hall. That music basically has its fruition there, and it keeps the scene really fascinating, I think, to the audience.
You think he's your friend? You tell me he's dead, so be it. I want to be sure he's dead before I go back to New York.
He wasn't behind anything. It was the lawyer.
What lawyer? What lawyer, Verbal?
You know, back when I was in that barbershop quartet in Skokie, Illinois.
You don't think I know you held out?
That was a strange cut, but Brian, I really, sometimes I believe in continually coming in closer to characters, closer, and don't break the intensity of them popping back out and sort of ruining the intensity. But I do remember Brian insisted that I cut back to the wide shot as he moved in when he sort of flicked his arm there, and but I got right back in again, so it worked out fine.
There was a lawyer.
And it's situations like that where you get to know the people you work with, where I know Brian likes to do that now. And so and if we had a very similar situation in our first feature where the same exact thing happened. We were in tight with two characters, and all of a sudden one starts getting strangled, and he had done a wide shot pushing in very close, and I had not used it. And I should have learned from that situation that he likes doing that, but now, I know. And those are the sort of experiences you build so that by the time you're doing your third or fourth movie, you have a real shorthand, and you know the director so well, you know what he's going to hate and like. And then again, I like to come up with new things too to try to convince the director to use. And so we create even new moments for us to talk about later.
Not bad. Can't complain. How's it going, Fister? Don't need to open it, right? It must be Keaton.
Redfoot, Dean Keaton, Todd Hockney, and Verbal Kint.
Verbal. Man with the plan, huh? You guys interested in any more work?
We're always looking for extra work.
We're on vacation.
Oh, yeah. That's too bad. I got a ton of work, and I don't have any good people. Not like you guys.
One of the main things that I was concerned about in this movie is so many things are talked about that I was really unsure if the audience is really listening, and if they're not listening, the film was going to be a disaster. And I remember having a screening for the first time with an audience, and we didn't really do any test screenings. We basically had a screening after the film was negative cut to see what people's feedback would be. And I remember that in the scene where Pete Postlethwaite comes in and talks to them and talks about the truckload of guns, that there had been a joke early in the film made about that, and as soon as Hockney reacted to that, the whole audience laughed, and that was a setup from the early lockup scene in the film, and it was well, the payoff to that actually. And this was like 3/4 of the way through the film now, and when the audience laughed at that moment, I realized, wow, they are really listening, and they may actually not only get the film but actually like it, because I was really convinced that no one would be listening or understanding what in the world was going on in this film. It was hard enough for me to keep straight, let alone think the audience was going to follow it. So I can't tell anyone how elated I was when we were watching with the audience and they were actually reacting to information that had been laid out in earlier scenes. Redfoot sort of has his own theme, which is what you hear in these sequences. It's sort of a dobro, used in a strange sense with some weird synthesizer sounds under it. And I don't know, it just keeps things moving and creates a sort of aura for his character.
One job. That's a good one, Keaton.
Keaton fought it as best he could, but a man can't change what he is. He can convince anyone he's someone else, but never himself. It took one day with McManus nagging, and we went back to work.
This scene, again, another example of short shooting schedule and not as much footage as you'd want. So, as with a lot of scenes, I had to create the illusion of there being a lot more shots than there really were by just cutting into them. And you know, some shots cover a lot of ground, but you cut them up into like 50 different pieces, and it seems like there's a ton more coverage. And especially if the director is changing the image sizes of shots in one shot all the time, if you cut those shots up, it's going to seem like there's a ton of footage, and it keeps the energy level up. I thought sure when these two guys were shot up against the van we were going to get just roasted, and people do laugh, but the reason we can get away with it in this movie is because everything that's being flashbacked is not necessarily true anyway, and so goofy things can happen, and they're completely forgiven by the audience because this all may be made up anyway. So when he does this double shot of them against the van, it's incredibly cheesy, you know, especially with the way the blood streaks down, but I don't know, you buy it. And even people laugh. They were completely with the movie. They didn't laugh in a disgusted way about the film. They laughed because they were with the movie.
But just hand over the case. Hand over the fucking case.
And musically, it helped too. This is an exception to the rule I talked about in the taxi heist. You really have to make a judgment call, and this particular scene, I wanted just laden with music, especially in the active section preceding this part. The music is a cacophony and wild, and it just adds energy to the action that not necessarily was there, but it just makes you feel like things are a lot more frenetic and chaotic with the music continually just swirling away. This is something I tend to love doing, just linger on shots, hearing the audio from what you're going to go into, and sort of keeps things moving, but also makes things interesting. You hear this sound coming from outside this van, you don't know what is that until you cut inside and you realize what was just going on. And of course it keeps an economy going in what you're watching, but it still gets the same point across without wasting time.
Guys, come on.
This scene's been talked about a lot, I'm sure, because again, this was a sort of a blooper I used, but it wasn't a very funny one necessarily. When Redfoot flicks his cigarette over to Stephen Baldwin, that it was not supposed to be that way. The burning ash actually went right into his eye, and of course I used it because it was great, but it was definitely not supposed to be that way. He was just supposed to flick it down. And I remember Peter Green was horrified in his footage when he did that. He was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." But those are the magic moments that you just, as long as no one really got hurt, that you can use.
Called me last night. He says he wants to meet you guys.
Okay. We'll meet him.
I'll call you.
Good. Do that. No problem.
I don't
Let's
like
go.
it, Dean. I don't like it. Wait a minute. One more thing, tough guy. Any more surprises, and I'm gonna kill you.
You're such a tough guy, McManus. But do me a favor, right? Get the fuck off my dick.
No. No.
You know, in scenes like this too, where you have extras brandishing guns and so forth, it can be really cheesy. So you got to really make sure that you just use the right amount of them, because it can bring down the intelligence of a film really quickly. So I kept the extras in the scene to a bare minimum.
Fuck you.
So this lawyer
Kobayashi.
came from Redford.
Right.
And why leave this out when you talk to the DA?
Dave, someone to see you.
Jack.
Been looking all over for you. Still after that coke that took a walk out of that bloodbath in the harbor yesterday?
Yeah.
Well, you can stop looking. There was no coke. I've been in L.A. County talking to a guy they pulled out of a drain pipe in San Pedro yesterday after the shootout. Came to this morning.
This guy pulled out of a drain pipe he's talking about was actually a scene we deleted from the film, which we'll talk about if we show this on the DVD. The guy pulled out of a drain pipe was a scene we actually filmed, but the dummy of Arturo Marquez, who they found dead, was so bad looking that we had to cut the scene out. And so it just talked about. Unfortunately, again, most people were listening enough to know that his body had been discovered without actually showing the scene. The scene was pretty cheesy anyway, so it behooved the film not to have it in the movie. But I did use pieces of it in montage sequences. The dummy was so expensive, we sort of felt compelled to use it in some way.
Over this for an hour and a half. What we need to do is find Redfoot, Keaton, and get the hell out of here now.
What we need to do is think.
This was fun to set up, just having this person staring at them and using wipes. Again, I think Brian knew that I would do this technique, so we covered him in 3 image sizes and had him wipe frame, or 2 image sizes. And this is, as I may have touched on before, this is a very, very, very long scene. But and I think that the music is one of the elements that really keeps it going. Of course, it doesn't start in yet, but when you start getting into the crux of what's going on, it's that theme that's sort of been laid out for the audience subliminally. You sort of wean them on this talking about Kaiser Soze mystery music, or mythical, magical music, and then when it starts coming in again, I think the audience feels like, oh, now we may come down to some answers here, and so I think the music itself keeps one engaged.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
It was a very difficult movie because of a short shooting schedule and so many characters to cover. And editorially, I had a lot of choices to what to do because when there were scenes like this where there's so many characters, if they were all covered, sometimes they couldn't cover all the characters in time. So that was painful sometimes in the editing room.
1981, Mr. Keaton, you participated in the hijacking of a truck in Buffalo, New York. The cargo was raw steel which belonged to Mr. Soze and which was destined for Pakistan to be used in a nuclear reactor.
There's also a fine line in the success of a score simply based upon how it's mixed. I mean, you can write a great score, but it's all for naught if it's not mixed correctly in the film. It may be too loud or maybe too soft, and that's a great advantage I had in this, being the editor and being at the dub and controlling the sound of the level of the music. A lot of a new trend in mixing films today is that dialogue mixers are doubling as music mixers as well, and there are a few that are good at it, but in most cases it really has caused a lot of scores to not be mixed effectively. We did have a dedicated music mixer on this film, and I would sit there with him and make sure that the gap between the dialogue and the music levels was very tight, because when you go to a theater, often the music gets absorbed. If it's mixed very subtly in the dub stage, you're hearing it just fine. But then you go to a theater and you've got 400 people in a room and it's not necessarily played very loud. The film isn't. That you miss the music, and therefore you're missing a great emotional moment in a film, or a mysterious one, or something to keep you engaged, and the film just tends to slow down without that score remaining present. And I think the music mixer did a great job on this, which is why no one should watch any film on a mono TV set. One of the big jokes in the film, as I'm sure has been talked about and is also touched upon in the blooper reel, is everyone's idea of what Keyser Soze's name was. Was it Soze or Sosa or Sousa, and so we have a lot of footage of actors saying it in different ways. And Pete here, I think he had mentioned his name in maybe 4 different incarnations, and so it was an editorial thing to get him to keep the takes where he's consistent in the way he mentions Mr. Soze. And I even think we let one go. It kind of says Souza, and I might have manipulated his voice on a couple. I can't really remember. But he has an awful lot of dialogue here, but he was a very, very prepared actor, and there wasn't a huge amount of manipulation to do with him, except for that Souza thing, which actually used to be Keyser Söze in the original script for so long. So when we actually shot the movie, it was just weird to hear Soze, because in the 11th hour they had to change the name because Chris, the writer, revealed that one of his past bosses' name was Sume, and we were afraid of him suing Chris or something for being portrayed as such an evil character. So literally, I think a couple days before the shot, they came up with Soze, which is interesting because it actually means verbal in some language. I think Hungarian, and that's why I think when Hungarian audiences watched the hospital scenes with the Hungarian yelling out Keyser Söze, basically the whole plot was given away right away for them. Again, this is really fun music to do here. It's just sort of, there's something really classic about this briefcase and their names, and I just had a blast scoring this. Also, when the briefcase opens, we made sure that the sound of the briefcase was extremely loud to sort of startle everyone, and those are the little fun things to do sound-wise. And then when Keaton looks at his photos showing Edie, it sort of briefly goes into the theme of the film again, but in a more sort of romantic, tender way, sort of reflecting his love for Edie and in a life that he could have had.
We got my whole life in here, everything I've ever done since I was 18.
That's really amazing, and this scene has probably gone on for, I don't know how long, a few minutes, and it's still very engaging. But it'd be a funny experiment to do, just to have a scene this length with absolutely no music in it, and I guarantee it would seem agonizing, because it felt that way in the editing room before I, came up with something to put in here.
Bricks Marlin.
Part of the art of film scoring, too, which is, I don't know, in my opinion, largely fallen by the wayside in recent years, is telling a story musically, where you can actually take the music away from the film and hear a story being told. And it takes a tremendous amount of planning and mapping out of what you're going to do with the score before you start writing. I think post schedules are so short now, and composers stack themselves up with so many films to do that a lot of thought isn't put into necessarily these days. Telling a story that's well thought out from beginning to end, and where you're going with the score. And it's like a good symphony. You'll hear themes that are touched upon in a symphony, but they come to their full fruition in the end of the symphony, because symphonies, most of them do tell a story. Or it depends on the era, of course, of the symphony. But and a good film score should hold back too, and just lay groundwork and lay hints, and then have sort of the fruition of those ideas come full throttle later in the film. But in order to do that and plan that out correctly, you've got to really sit down and watch the entire film, and then sort of in latently think about where you're going with the score ultimately.
Running dope, they say. They come to his home.
This was a really interesting scene. It's one of the few days I actually was on the set, because we have this whole thing about me not being there, so I don't know about the geography, so I can break rules without realizing I'm breaking rules in the editing room. But this was done in the step frame process in camera. Brian, which I agree with, doesn't believe in doing effects like this in post-production because it has this cheesy sort of cable movie look to it. But if you do it, actually, if you plan ahead for this stuff and it's not done as an afterthought, but as a forethought as you're shooting, it has a really much more organic and artistic look to it. And I believe this was done, and the camera was undercranked, and then step printed. So I was given a bunch of footage that was very strange looking, and I had to, boy, if memory serves correctly, the process was expensive for a low-budget movie like this, so I had to really go through all the footage before the process had been done to it and choose what I was probably going to use editorially. So a lot of planning had to be in my mind's eye as to what I was going to use ultimately without having to do the process to all of the footage that was shot for the scene. So that was a difficult scene to cut, which you wouldn't know on the surface because I really had to choose ahead of time what footage I was going to use. More jump cuts there, just to get us out of that scene, that shot. Part of editing too is, if you don't know about editing, is keeping those pregnant pauses, is deciding how long they last. I mean, I could have had Spacey answer that question right away, but no, instead there's a moment where he thinks, and sometimes an actor Wheeler will have not done that, and so a big part of the editor's job is really creating performances that may or may not have been there. Spacey didn't take much manipulation at all. He did do those moments, but there's many times with different characters and actors where you want to create pregnant pauses, or sometimes they are pausing way too much and eating up the scenery where you just cut all the pauses out. So it's a very, very powerful thing, editing, in terms of shaping performances. Unless it's a scene like this where there's no coverage and it's just, this is where you choose the best take overall because there's no coverage in a scene like this, and there shouldn't be. It's a decision of the director just to sort of move in, and it's an economic thing as well. There's no time, and it's you weigh out the importance of the scene and whether it's worth getting coverage or not.
A couple of years. A lot of guys equate him to that reporter on The Incredible Hulk. You've heard of him? Well, on the street? Yeah. Yeah, a few times, outside stuff. Somebody working for a guy, worked for a guy who got some money from Kaiser Soze.
One of my philosophies with editing, and of course every philosophy has exceptions and can be broken depending on the scene, is to keep all the characters in the room for the audience. In other words, I never like to spend too much time on one character without seeing the reaction. And the eyes seem to always tell me when to cut to the other character, and it's also what's exactly being said by one character, which dictates when to cut to the other listening. And this keeps everyone on the screen, so to speak, without seeming contrived. It's a fine line between cutting to characters too much and staying away from them, but it sort of is a philosophy of mine. It keeps films interesting by bouncing reactions off of different characters and keeping all the characters in the room visually. And of course, a lot of those reactions are manufactured. They could be from some other take. There was, I don't know if this was it or not, but there was a cue I actually cut out of the movie. It might have been this scene. I know it was in this setting. Where, a good music mixer has the guts to turn to you as a composer and say, what do you think about cutting out this cue? And of course, your first reaction is, what are you saying? But it really was this really short transitionary cue. I think it opened this scene. And it was literally like, 10 seconds long or maybe 15 seconds. And it felt so much like TV because it was so short. And short connector cues is something I really normally don't like doing anyway. So it didn't take much of an argument for him to get rid of it. He just ran it by me, and I think in the back of my head I'd been thinking that anyway, so the moment he sort of mentioned it to me, it didn't take much for me to say, yeah, fine, get rid of it.
What happened next?
We woke up the next morning and Fenster was gone. He couldn't handle the idea of slumming for Soze. He left us a note wishing us good luck and took a chunk of the money we'd scraped together.
Then what?
Well, McManus was furious. He was talking about tracking him down and ripping his heart out, all sorts of shit. That night we got the call.
What call?
Kobayashi told us where we could find Fenster.
This was a very hard scene because of focus issues. It was a low light situation, and I'm sure rushed, as most of the film was shot in a frenzy. And I remember sitting there watching dailies. This is one of the earlier scenes that I was watching with a friend of mine, because no one ended up going to dailies after a while. It was just me in a room all by myself, and sort of looking at my life flash before my eyes, wondering how in the world am I going to do this, because there was so many focus drift issues on this, and it was all shot from one direction basically. So the cutting was a little difficult.
I don't know about you, Peg Leg, but I can run. I got no problem with that.
Kobayashi doesn't seem to have a problem with it either.
You run, and we're gonna be digging a hole for you. You got that?
This ain't my boy we're burying. I don't know anybody. So fuck you.
He was my partner for 5 years. We did more jobs, and I saw more money than you can ever count. So fuck you! Because now it's payback!
It's not payback. It's precaution. You want payback, you want to run, I don't care.
I'm not doing this for Fenster. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing this for me. I'm gonna finish this thing. This Kobayashi bastard is not gonna stand on me.
Of course, this is a great moment, the roundness of the cave matching the roundness of the coffee cup.
After they kill Fenster, nobody would run?
Kind of. You can make it, see, it fits really nicely. And I remember doing this optical a million times.
Keaton wouldn't have it. It was too far-fetched for him.
And because we were on film, of course, you couldn't render the opticals the way, like on a computer system now, you can basically do a dissolve and see pretty much exactly how it's going to look. But on film, of course, all you have is a grease pencil to show that there's going to be dissolve there. And so when you finally get the optical back and look at it in the theater, it may not be exactly what you had planned, so you have to keep redoing it and redoing it and redoing it until it's right. This is another example of a quote-unquote action sequence done on a shoestring budget where there wasn't a whole lot of coverage. I pretty much milked the elevator shaft a lot, sort of keep cutting back and forth. But if you notice, there's really not a whole lot of different things I'm cutting to. It's basically between the same two shots, moving in with these guys and the elevator, and upstairs with Steven. I was really happy with this cue in the movie. One of my favorite moments is when we cut outside at the end of the sequence and go over the buildings. It's this huge, glorious moment, and it sounded so great. And I remember being in the dub. I know this as being a director, you can suddenly have these flashes of insecurity, and Brian suddenly had a worry about it and was like, oh my God, it doesn't work. And thank God Chris McQuarrie was sitting there in the mix at that moment and said, no, I think it's great. And I was like, thank God Chris was here at that moment, because the score was in jeopardy of being axed at that moment in the mix. I don't know what we would have replaced it with, but it's one of my favorite parts of the score. Coming up right here. We didn't really have a lot of money, of course, on this movie, and as the film was taking shape, it was starting to look like a much bigger movie than I had ever envisioned, and so I began getting very worried about the music, because here this is starting to look like a major movie, and I'm gonna be a laughingstock if the music doesn't sound really, in the same league as the film. And so it was a huge amount of pressure to basically, with no budget, get the sound we got from the score. And I remember early on in the process when this film was still in the very rudimentary beginnings in a script stage, that one of the producers, Robert Jones, flew out from London to meet with me, and he's saying, so, okay, you haven't edited a film in about a year and a half. And I go, yeah, that's right. He goes, you've never really scored a film for real. You did Ryan's first movie with a synthesizer. And I go, yeah, that's right. And you can do this, right? Right, uh-huh. I remember going home, and that's when the heart palpitations were beginning. And I was terrified the whole time that I could pull this off, because really I had never done it at this level before. And you say with a gulp, oh, well, yeah, sure, I can do this, no problem. But Brian sort of had them in a situation where they had to agree, because I was in the deal as being both the editor and the composer, because of what we saw happen on our first feature, which was a great symbiosis between the cutting and the scoring. So they were sort of, they had no choice, but I could tell their nervousness, and their nervousness didn't really help me out at all, because it made me just as nervous. Oh yeah, and in the end, I think they realized everything was going to be just fine, but at least editorially, of course, they hadn't heard the music yet, so I would do my synthesized renderings of the score. But back then, I had really bad equipment, and my renderings would sound pretty crapola. And I do remember, though, a major moment for me was when we showed the film to some executives at a big theater at Paramount. We rented the theater there. And I brought a cassette tape, of all things, of my synthesized rendering of the main theme, and played it for the approval of everyone. And that's a very scary moment when the theme upon which you're passionate about basing the entire film is up for judgment, and if they don't like it, you're like, what are you going to do? It can be an extremely crushing experience if no one likes it. But they liked it, and so I was sort of home free in my mind, writing the score based upon that style of music. Although, again, the comment was, with the executives, was like, well, we were expecting, something a lot more hip, and which was exactly what we didn't want to do, and fall into that trap. This is a scene where, as an editor, I was kind of initially disappointed because there was no coverage on any of the actors except for this one shot of the four of them in a lineup, and that was done for time, of course, and but it ends up working fine.
I'll make myself clear. We will take
And besides, it's it's all about Keaton here anyway, with Edie, so it makes sense. I love the shot of the reflection in the mirror to sort of wrap up this sequence, and just scored the hell out of it. And again, a lot of the obvious thing to do with a score would be to be really evil here, because it's an evil person walking in. But no, it's even more bizarre and more unsettling if you do something a little against the grain, where it's pensive and strange, or romantic even, over an image of a bad person, and that just adds elegance to the film, and to me more believability is in terms of taking away from being a caricature of what you expect, and instead being the real thing.
Brings me to Sunny Point number 2. Even if one of us gets through and jacks the boat, we still get nothing.
What if we wait for the money?
10 more men at least. Look, in my opinion, it can't be done. Anybody who goes in there is not coming out alive.
I'm gonna wait for the money.
Me too.
Did you hear what he just said?
If I'm going in, I want to cut.
Brian's, you can tell every shot is always moving in, which is a great thing. It keeps you involved. In addition to the editing, it's sort of a twofold process, the editing and the moving in. It's really a great thing. I call it the slow creep.
The news said it's raining in New York.
And it also is very economic, because in one shot, if you have no time to shoot a wide shot, a medium shot, and a close-up, and do 3 different setups, all you do is one shot, but just keep moving in. And inevitably, the design of a scene editorially is always to move in throughout the course of a scene anyway. And so again, it makes the director look good that there's a hell of a lot more footage than there really is, because the editor is creating this evolution of a scene by using different image sizes that are actually in the course of one take. Starting here was where I started telling a story that was not necessarily in the script. This whole entire boat sequence, especially inside the boat, which I'll talk about later, was something that was extremely nebulous in the script always. And I do remember that in the script as well, there was a hell of a lot more extravagant things that occurred that Brian had to make the decision to cut out because of budgetary and time reasons. So there was somewhat of a plan shooting all of this stuff in the exterior, but when we got inside the boat, there's this whole process of events that occur, especially when they're looking around for the drugs and searching, that was absolutely not scripted whatsoever. And the second unit guy had to go and just film a bunch of stuff in the boat, but he wasn't actually sure what he was filming, and Brian was of course busy doing the main unit stuff outside the boat, so he sent Ken, one of the producers and second unit person, in there to do all this footage. So I remember being at in the editing room and getting a phone call from Ken saying, "Okay, I'm shooting all this stuff inside that boat, but what am I supposed to be shooting?" And I go, "Well, you ever seen Star Trek II?" And he goes, "No." And I go, "Well, when they go aboard this space station, Nebula 1, it's just a series of shots of doors opening, exposing people's faces, and then, you know, cut to Kirk, and then cut to Bones in another place walking in some stairs, and it cuts to someone else." And I'm sure they didn't have a really big set, but it made it feel as if they were lurking about this entire space station. And I said, "Do the same thing. Just give me some shots of doors opening, faces walking past camera." And so what Ken had done is, and one of the classic examples of that is, and he did a really good job on, is when Keaton opens this bulkhead and comes in, he's all red, and then walks past camera. But what he had done is continued to follow the actors throughout the entire location of where he was shooting. So for instance, if he was in an engine room or something, he'd have them walk down the stairs, the camera would pan with them to go to the other part of the room, and then out the door. Well, then I would take that one shot and create 4 different locations with it. In other words, I would, cut from that shot to another actor doing another location, then cut back to the same setup again, but it's another part of the room, so it would feel like a completely different part of the ship. So I was able to sort of organize all these shots into this sort of mini story I told of them lurking about inside the ship. Through basically maybe 3 locations that Ken had to work with, and making it seem as if they were all over the ship in about 17 different locations. It's rare that you get the opportunity to cut in sequence because they're not shooting out of sequence, and you're desperately, as the editor, trying to keep up with them as they're shooting. And so you do have to have the bigger picture. And a film like this is, like I said, a brain hemorrhage to try to figure out, okay, here's the scene that they shot, which is way out of sequence. Where am I in the story? What's going on? So, but then you get your editor's assembly together, and you sit back and watch and make sure everything's making sense. This was a great scene for me to do. It was I remember just having a blast editing this entire sequence from the moment we come to this setting of the shipyard, and just building the tension slowly.
Nice. How you doing?
With editorially. And the music here too, it gives it this sort of ongoing tension.
Fernando. ¿Qué hace aquí? Nada?
And it was just, it looked really good, and it's for some reason this scene just inspired me on my little flatbed as I'm looking at the screen. This was the bomb subplot that began. This part of the bomb plot we used, of course, because it got them into the ship. But again, the other part that we cut out was when Keaton actually lays the bomb in the ship, and instead just inferred that it was the gas that blew up the ship accidentally. And there is a scene, and one of the lost scenes in the DVD is a very, very small moment where I'd cut out early, but we could see Keaton actually laying the bomb in the engine room.
Old MacDonald.
And it's always great to hold off musically there. Instead of do the obvious thing, which is build with the music, you instead come down. You have this odd moment where you have this lull before the storm, and then boom. And that's the great thing about storytelling is peaks and valleys, which Brian and I are always talking about, where a lot of films today are all climax and no foreplay, as one critic put it. I wish I'd coined that phrase, but I didn't. But that is the problem. Everything is just for its supreme moment instead of holding back and creating these peaks and valleys to tell a good story and make things exciting for the audience. It's not as if when you have a quiet moment, the audience is going to leap out of the theater. Although these films still make hundreds of millions of dollars, so it tells Hollywood that they keep making movies like that. But then one like this comes along, and as long as the story is good enough, it's all about story, then no matter, if you take these moments of pause, the audience is going to be even more involved in the film. It was also a fun sequence to do because it was a break from all the conversational areas of the movie, where it was like I felt like I was editing an action film, so it was a lot of fun. One of the only cuts we made in the film after showing it to the audience was in this sequence where, a very small cut where Baldwin is going down a hatch and sort of cut a couple shots out. The audience just felt like this sequence went on just a little bit too long, but that was pretty much the only cut we made. Which is the great thing about making a movie for yourselves as opposed to the general consensus scorecards that an audience fills out. And this way, films are a little more bold and take more chances because you're not trying to make every single person happy. This is a sequence we completely got away with. It's not like Keyser Söze from another planet or dimension, but you know what's going on here. But for some reason, you buy it because it's just that sense of wonder. It's like he's around, his presence is there, and even though it's his surrealistic moment, it works to keep the audience totally engaged. This shot was pretty much the only shot I had of Spacey throughout this entire boat sequence, and so I pretty much milked it. We had a lot of takes of it just moving in constantly, so it enabled me to get away from the action and cut back to Spacey a lot in terms of his reactions. And it allowed me to get to different parts of the boat without having to worry about too much continuity.
Why didn't you run?
Froze up.
We actually put a gunshot inside that door sound to sort of startle Spacey and the audience. Especially after what he's just been talking about, which is gun battles.
Boy came across a body on the beach this morning, thrown clear when the boat burned, shot twice in the head. 2 guys from the Bureau just identified him.
What else?
His name was Arturo Marquez, a petty smuggler from Argentina. He was arrested last year in New York for trafficking. He escapes to California. They pick him up in Long Beach. They're setting up extradition. He escapes again. Now, get this. Edie Finneran's brought in to advise on the proceedings.
Kobayashi.
New York faxed me a copy of his testimony. He was a rat.
Yeah, a big fucking rat.
Arturo was very opposed to returning to prison. So much so that he named close to 50 people. Guess who he named in the finale?
Keyser Söze.
And again, Kuyan comes in here, and we're about to cut back to Verbal's story. And actually, now it's Kuyan's story, telling him what he feels is going on. And the obvious choice would be to return to full score as we slam cut into this, but instead, it's better just to not have score for a moment and feel like you're in the reality of the situation, because score really is there for emotional reasons, or if you feel the scene is lacking in something. But it's great to sort of hold back and just be there with the characters and hear the sounds of the boat and so forth, and the sounds in the ship that are haunting Arturo Marquez. Here's a shot that was Keaton walking in a room. Of course, the camera had panned with him and gone to another section, and then into another section. I cut it up into a million pieces, and that's the Star Trek II shot. Instead, it's not William Shatner, it's Keaton. But all this stuff really worked out well. That's Brian saying, "Stay quiet." It was originally my voice. I was very proud of what I'd done, but he wanted to have his cameo, so my "Stay quiet" and "Shut up" got replaced by Brian.
I'm telling you, it's Kaiser Soze!
But I got all the breathing behind the ropes. Anytime there's verbal behind the ropes staring at the scene, it's me breathing, because we didn't have time to do Kevin's ADR and do his breathing there. This is more great second unit shots by Ken. He's able to sort of, again, create this sort of mysterious situation going on in the boat. It just sort of makes you creeped out. And is that Kaiser Soze or is it not Kaiser Soze? The door closing. And I always search for, when I was organizing all these scenes together, which could have gone in any order, I always, of course, look for dark areas so I can link shots together in a sort of interesting way. One is this, where it moves into blackness, and the next shot is another dark shot where the door opens almost as if it was from that other shot preceding it. That's the same shot as the longer shot before in the sequence of Keaton opening the door, but a close-up instead. And again, for all we know, it's a different door, another place in the ship. And that was a great reaction shot of Arturo Marquez that wasn't really planned, but we sort of put in a sound of that Baldwin had kicked something and must be in close proximity to Arturo Marquez so that he reacts to the sound. And this is the scene where, after they speak, that Keaton originally laid a bomb in the engine room. But I cut out just before he did that to change the storyline.
I don't know. There's no coke. What?
And it was, obviously there was no engine sounds going on in this room, and it was so great that for a change, actors really were yelling at the top of their lungs. Sometimes when you bar scenes and so forth, the actors are not yelling, and they put in the music, and they have to, the source music of the rock music in the background of a bar, and then they have to play it so low because the actors didn't yell over like a nightclub scene. And so it's really great when they keep in mind that they're in a loud room, so then we can really pump up those engine sounds. You can tell here I was kind of running out of second unit shots, so I get that same hallway shot again, very similar to the other one. But you know, you just feel like you're just in another area once again. And then upcoming is the big moment of the score. You've heard little moments of Kaiser Soze's theme peppered throughout the movie, which is based upon the theme of the movie loosely. And here it has its big final moment because Kaiser Soze has got his man. And this is the part I was holding off on for the whole movie until it has its big moment of glory right here. Not knowing what I was going to do for score, I just kept this long and just didn't edit it down and kept this entire shot knowing that this was going to be a big moment score-wise. What exactly it was, I wasn't sure, but I knew it was going to be a huge moment for score.
What the fuck is going on?
Strangest thing.
Again, these sections with no dialogue are often points where the editor has a lot of freedom to sort of tell a story because there's just a ton of footage shot, or sometimes not enough footage, but and these kind of things are often loosely scripted as to exactly what's happening, especially when they're changed when they shoot. Normally Keaton was supposed to have been hit by a giant crane. You know, obviously that was extremely cost prohibitive, so he was just shot by the mysterious stranger.
And that's what you say in your statement. You saw a man in a suit with a slim build.
Wait a minute.
I don't have a minute. Now, are you saying you saw Kaiser Soze? You told the DA you didn't know who it was.
I know there was dope on that boat.
Stop stalling,
I'm
Verbal.
not stalling.
You know what I'm getting
Get
at.
out of my face.
You know
Hey,
what I'm getting at.
I got immunity. I don't have to take that shit.
You know what I'm getting at, Verbal.
I
Yes,
don't
you
know what
do.
you're talking about.
The truth. Try to tell me you
I
saw.
love overlap in dialogue in a scene, which can be problematic sometimes in the editing room because you have different takes of when the actors aren't told to not overlap each other's shot. But, you know, many times you just say screw that rule because it really inhibits the actor and you just deal with it in post later. And fortunately it worked out. It was even harder to be on mag track and being spliced together sound tape and try to make these interruptions cool and smooth and dub in other lines to make this seem seamless and all these interruptions, but it worked out fine. I tend not to if it's a really intense scene, I tend not to inhibit the actors and say, okay, don't overlap his line, because it really you lose a lot of energy, and you can, with the miracle of editing and now digital technology, you can, and dubbing, you can really fix it later in post. Again, here's the moment where we build up to Kaiser Soze's theme once again, since he's out and about in the open and doing his thing. And if you listen closely, you can hear my breathing when we're behind these ropes. So here's the new plot. Instead of a bomb having been set, you know, we repeat this sequence of Brian's foot in my hand. My hand is missing from this sequence, where the cigarette just drops on the gas and blows up the ship, which we thought was a lot simpler. It's really a repeat of the opening sequence, of course, and we actually did some reprinting to make sure the shots were exactly the same. Now this sequence is an interesting one coming up in that the DP had done an amazing job following Kuyan around the table and whipping up and catching him just at the right moment, and it was a constant constant interrogation of Kuyan, and once in a while tilting down to verbal. But this was late in the making of the film, where Brian came over late one night and he goes, "There's got to be something more we can do," and he really pushed me to do something with this. And so I thought about it and realized I had tons of footage of things he was possibly talking about throughout the movie, and it was a later scene in the film and shot later in the film, so I knew the rest of the footage of the movie really well. And so I cut up all of Tom's beautiful camera work, but it really made this an engaging sequence, and yet still something was wrong because I had chosen not to score it. And most directors don't. That's a great moment right there, where I sort of stumbled across the fact that I could dub in Kuyan's lips over Arturo. Same there with Spacey. It's was really great discoveries. Doing crazy things like that. So I really was proud of the sequence and thought I had saved the film in this regard, but then there was something missing, and Brian insisted I score it, and I really had not planned to. And he kind of said, just do something like boom, boom, boom, boom, boom, boom, boom. Of course, as a composer, you're not really sure what that's supposed to mean. I interpreted that as being sort of, you know, bass pizzicato on the basses, and so I did this sort of ongoing building thing, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, and until the end of the scene, and it really made the whole sequence just it's really quite a masterful sequence. The reason behind this entire sequence was the fact that played out. Not only was it not dynamic enough, but the point of the sequence was that was to throw the audience off that perhaps maybe it is Keaton all along. Maybe he is Kaiser Soze. How do we get the audience to believe that? And unfortunately, that didn't come across just in dialogue, and so we needed the support of visuals. And so that's why it was decided upon to create an editorial montage out of the thing, which ends up sort of being our trademark on every movie we do together. But so it was the agonizing process of going through the entire film and telling us a mini story editorially with the footage of Keaton, adding suspicion on him, and you know, we had some really great shots of Keaton, you know, moving into him really closely and looking evil, and it really did work for a lot of the audience. They really were supposing that perhaps Keaton was the guy.
You had to hide when you first heard the police cars. You said you heard the shot before the fire, but you didn't see him die.
I knew him. He would never.
He programmed you. He programmed you to tell us just what he wanted you to. He knew we were close. You said it yourself. Where was the political pressure coming from? Why were you being protected? It was Keaton. Immunity was your reward.
But why me? Why not Fester or McManus or Hockney? Why me? I'm stupid. I'm a cripple. Why me?
Because you're a cripple, Verbal. Because you're stupid. Because you're weaker than them. If he's dead, if what you say is true, then it won't matter.
In terms of timing, we had Spacey say a lot more in this scene as the scene progressed on, and you know, and you get the feeling, you try to put yourself in the audience's place, and that, okay, this is probably just enough, so we should probably cut out some of the things he's saying. He goes on and on about, I forgot exactly what he goes on and on about, but it's pretty superfluous, and it was a little too whiny, and so we cut out a lot of dialogue, and not a lot, but a good chunk out of the end of the scene, which I have on the DVD.
Spook story. But I know Keaton, and someone is out there pulling strings for you. Stay here and let us protect you.
No way. I'm not bait. I post today.
You posted 20 minutes ago. Captain Leo wants you out of here ASAP, unless you turn states.
I'll take my chances. Thank you.
If someone wants to get you, they're gonna get you out there. Turn states evidence. You might never see trial.
Maybe so. But I'm not a rat, Agent Kuyan.
This was dubbed fucking cops.
Fucking cops.
I mean, not ADR, but it was taken from another take. I remember doing that just to make it a little better, because we liked the visual, but didn't like the way he said it.
Excuse me.
As Brian's probably pointed out, that's his mother there. So in apt pupil, we put my mother as a doctor in that movie.
One watch, gold. One cigarette lighter, gold. One pack of cigarettes, thank you.
You still got nothing, Dave. I know what I wanted to know about Keaton. Which is nothing. No matter. He'll have to know how close.
And this was one of the cross-cutting things that I did, so that to sort of get us out of that room, and cross-cut between him leaving and them talking in the room, just to keep it interesting and carry Kuyan's dialogue over these shots, which is something that's always, again, economical and interesting to do, as opposed to just having this scene, then having the scene of him leaving, and then back to them again. It would just be too agonizing.
Man, you're a slob.
Yeah, but it all has a system, Dave. It all makes sense when you look at it right. You gotta, like, stand back from it, you know? You wanna see a real horror show? See my garage.
So this becomes sort of the crowning moment, at least in the editing room for me, where this is, you know, the big escape and the big realization and catharsis. And I didn't have a whole lot to use in the bulletin board, but and even after this entire sequence through the end of the film was cut, it still had many problems. For one thing, I didn't have any voiceovers at all, so that I went in and on my mag tracks, I could only listen to 2 tracks at the same time, but I needed to imagine the third overlapping dialogue. Is I took all the dialogue from throughout the movie and created an audio montage as well, which really added to the visuals that we were seeing, and it sort of really made everything come together thematically and idea-wise, and just made things really bizarre. But then the other problem was musically, at least not in this section, but in the getaway sequence of Verbal, I had temped the music in with like getaway music and very tense music. And the scene was a disaster for us, and we thought, okay, here's the final scene of the movie, and it's a complete, utter disaster. It was basically because the music was wrong. And because obviously this is not, it is a getaway, but there's something very magical and mysterious about this guy. So after this realization is when I went into this action music right here, and it just did not work. Well, I remember surprising Brian. We had a screening that we were going to show just ourselves and a couple people that we knew. And I had stumbled across Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, which is a very sort of like mysterious and magical piece of music. And it's basically what I ended up sort of ripping off for the end of the movie. And it completely made the sequence, because this became this magical, eerie sequence, or ironic sequence, as opposed to dun dun dun dun dun, he's getting away. And it made a moment like this when his foot straightens out just this really great moment.
No arch criminals at all.
Somebody with power.
There was
somebody who was capable of tracking us to New York.
You think a guy like that is this close to getting caught and sticks his head out?
I mean, instead we have a euphoric moment here when he's getting away, as opposed to a horrible moment. And it's hard to explain exactly what it does to you, but I go by feeling a lot, and if I'm freaked out by something I'm listening to in a good way, then I feel everyone else is going to be too. And a lot of the dialogue too, in combination with the music, it just had this symbiosis, which was just really, it just worked. Thank God, because here was the end of the movie, and it really wasn't working at all. And also, I cut up a lot more than I had originally planned. The cross-cutting between the fax machine and him being outside and the feed, and a huge amount of planning out to pull this off editorially.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was...
And this final shot is one that'll always drive me crazy, because it's so brilliant, and it wasn't my idea. And I remember, we had ended the movie and cut to black, and there was just something not final. There wasn't enough of a button on it. And I remember Brian was bugged by it too, and he called me from his car phone as I'm sitting there at the flatbed, and he goes, this is probably a dumb idea. Don't just forget it. I'm not even mentioning it. I go, what is it? And he goes, oh, well, what if we just cut to that shot of him, saying and using his hand and saying, then he was gone. And I said, oh my God, that's brilliant. That's so brilliant. I mean, I had an immediate reaction that was brilliant. And he's like, you sure? And I go, it's brilliant, believe me. So, we have a good enough relationship where we have no ego involved. It's like, if it's great, I'll say, you know what, it's great, but goddamn, I wish I had thought of that, And so it created a really terrific button for the end of the film. And then with the music slamming that as well, and the way it was timed out, it just, it's just one of those moments that just makes everyone clap. And I think without it, the impact wouldn't have nearly been there. When I watched this movie, I just realized how this couldn't be done today very well. We broke so many rules, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Brian had this unprecedented final cut deal where we basically could do what we wanted to do. It didn't have to answer to a test screening audience and score numbers and so forth. The bottom line is, if this film makes us happy, then we hope you'll like it too. And I think that's the best films are born from that, because you have more of a point of view of the filmmakers as opposed to watering down the film for the least common denominator. And even from the way the music was. I mean, again, this was the main statement of this film is, look, this is a more elegant effort. This is a romantic version of a crime film, and with some taste. And I think the score basically confirmed that from frame one, and basically saying, look, this is something different. And And basically, that's I don't know. I don't think a lot of this could be done today, especially with the way films are even further manipulated by test scores and test screenings. I mean, they always have been, but not to the ridiculous degree that they are today. There was a lot more chances taken back then, and it wasn't a very expensive movie. So I mean, the great thing about doing a low-budget movie is you can take a lot of chances and not worry about a huge financial impact it may have, because there's no supposition that the film's going to make a ton of money anyway. So the perceived loss by taking a chance isn't so great, and that's we had the advantage of doing in this. The edited on film credit at the end is a funny story. Because so many films were starting to be edited on the electronic medium, and those were the worst edited films at that time. And such a hardship editing a film like this on an old flatbed Steenbeck that I wanted to put a joke at the end saying edited on a piece of shit Steenbeck, but instead I just changed the title to edited on film as a sort of like to all those films that were being done electronically. And the funny thing is Tim Robbins had seen the film, or his editor or someone, for Dead Man Walking, and they edited on film as well, and so they put edited on a piece of crap Steenbeck at the end of their title, so they kind of like built off of my joke.